Okay, so our guest today is David Canfield, who again is the composer of the concerto that Dave Lynn played to win the concerto competition. And Chris is going to kind of lead discussion today, and I'm going to kind of be there to back up if need be, but I don't think it'll be needed, but I'll try. So Chris, take it away.
Chris, you're muted.
All right, thanks, Professor. Thanks, Corey. Thank you so much, David, for being with us today for this interview with the Wind Ensemble. One of the things that the students, I think, are most interested to hear is kind of about your musical journey, sort of how you grew up in music, and just from your website, I can tell you have an interesting story. But also, especially out of college, how did you come into your career? And how did you sort of become who you are today?
Only by the mercy of God did I develop into anything other than a footnote in some arcane musicological journal. I grew up in a musical household, though. My parents were both musicians, and my father was a conductor, a violinist, a wannabe composer. He never really got to be professional status in that. My mother was a violinist and a wonderful woman, and so I was hearing concerts from a very early age, live concerts, many of which my father was actually conducting with the orchestras that he had at the time. And we would go to all kinds of musical events, not just symphony concerts, but string quartet concerts. I can remember sitting on my father's lap when I was about 10 years old, listening to the Bartók string quartets, following the scores at that time. And I'm not sure that I was a big fan of Bartók when I was 10, but I have come to love him ever since then. And so I went to school, to college in my undergraduate school as a chemistry major, because I didn't think that, I got interested in chemistry from around the 8th grade on. And 2.5 years of chemistry more or less made me decide that I was probably going to be a better musician, since I had it in my genes, as it were, than I was a chemist. And so at that point, I transferred to the school where my father was the head of the music department at the time, and he knew that I knew certain things and could exempt me out of the courses that would otherwise have been required. And so I was able to graduate after 1.5 years of studying music at that college without having to extend beyond the usual 4-year period of undergraduate work. Well, I don't know. I don't want to get too long-winded in the answer to the question, because there's a long distance between where I was after I finished my undergraduate studies and here where I'm sitting right now. I'll try to make it as brief as possible. I moved back to Fort Lauderdale, where I partly grew up, and played professionally in the Fort Lauderdale Symphony Orchestra, and might still be playing professionally down as a violinist in those South Florida orchestras, except my grandmother called me out of the blue one day and offered to finance my first year of graduate school. Wow. Well, make a long story short, I ended up at Indiana University, got my master's and doctorate in music composition there. And after all of those graduate studies, I decided I did not want to go into academia. So what was I going to do to support myself? Well, I first took a job in a music library, thinking that would be an interesting career. But after about 1 year or 2 of that, I discovered how boring library work was. And at that point, I started a record business. And I've been in the record business as the main means of my financial support for the last 42 years. I'm semi-retired from that now, so I can do more writing of music. But it's been a great career, and I feel grateful to have had it. The very work that Dave Lynn is going to be playing was the work that's changed my life as a composer. Because if it hadn't been for that work, which I originally wrote as a request to fulfill a request from my father, there was a double bass faculty member at Indiana University that wanted to play with my father's orchestra, the Blooming Pops, and he wanted to play a work by Reinhold Glier called Intermezzo in Tarantella. And so my father asked me to orchestrate that work so that this soloist could play it with his orchestra. And after that was done, this was back in the 1990s, I began thinking about what other solo instrument could be taken, could take the place of the double bass, which I've never been particularly fond of as a solo instrument. And so the alto saxophone came to mind. I arranged it for that, dedicated to Eugene Rousseau, who's very well known in the saxophone world. And that launched me into the consciousness when it was premiered in Bangkok in 2009 at a World Saxophone Congress. It launched me immediately into the consciousness of about 1,000 saxophonists, and that basically propelled my compositional career into a much greater state of consciousness in the public than it would have otherwise ever had. So that's a very truncated answer, as long as it was, but it's a rather complicated situation that got me into music.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got into composition? Like, when did you first start writing?
Right. My father trained me on the piano. He was not really a pianist, but he certainly knew more than his 6-year-old son did. And so my first lessons were in piano. And when I was 7 or thereabouts, I started picking out little tunes at the piano and started writing them down. So my first earliest compositions date from the age when I was 7. And I didn't know anything about the way music is put together then, so they are quite inept. I was no Mozart or anybody like that. But gradually, between having been blessed by God with a good ear and some more theory lessons from my father, I began to develop some sense of how music is really structured and put together. And it just developed from there. But as I say, I never dreamed when I was a kid, or probably up until the age I was when the Concerto for Glier was premiered, which would have been when I was, let's see, 59. So we're not talking about a long period of time between the last 11 years, basically, where I had any hope of being known as a composer. And so most of my life, I've never really thought about, I mean, I've written music throughout my entire life, but I've never really thought it would amount to anything, given the number of composers that are out there, until the last 11 years.
Has that sort of success and notoriety you've had recently, how has that affected how you approach composition?
I think it's made me more careful, because when nobody's paying any attention to your music, it doesn't matter that much if it's any good. Although I did have a desire from an early age to write as well as I could at the time, but learning to be, it's not just learning how to write music that's important, but it's learning how to be self-critical about what you've written, and to depend upon your ear to know that something is good or mediocre or just downright bad, and then not be satisfied with a piece of music until you're convinced that it's as absolutely as good as you can possibly make it. And that has filtered into my consciousness probably more and more over the last 10 or 20 years.
So I'm not sure if the professor has told you this, but all our students are doing like a sort of online composition, collaborative composition thing right now. And pardon me?
The band students are all doing a composition project?
Yeah. All the band students. So they're sort of making these little segments. Everyone is improvising these little segments that they then kind of put together electronically and try to order in some way that makes sense to them. And so many of these students, some of these students are composers and have composition experience, while others have, starting at square one, they haven't really made up something of their own before. So could you share a little bit of insight into your process of composition, maybe from, the genesis of work all the way out to completion?
Well, for someone who's just getting into composition, I can make a couple of recommendations if that would also be valuable to hear. First of all, listen to a lot of music by a lot of different kinds of composers and see what appeals to your ear in the various styles that these thousands of composers have written in. And then if it's possible, follow along with a score to the works. If you listen to the standard repertoire, it's easy to find scores in any music library. And don't start off with anything too ambitious. Probably a good place to start is writing something for piano, maybe for string quartet, something like that. But before you get going on a piece, you have to know the characteristics of each instrument. In other words, if you write for piano and you write 2 notes at either end of the keyboard, then you're not going to also simultaneously write a note in the middle of the keyboard. As one composer, I think it was CPE Bach did one time, presented a friend of his with a piece with notes at the 3 extremes. And his friend says, "How can you play that note in the middle?" He says, "With your nose." But you can't really write successfully for instruments if you don't know their ranges, their characteristics, the finger patterns of the piano that are possible and the ones that are impossible. You have to know something about the instruments for which you're writing before you get going on it. And these are all very important things. In my own case, when I wrote my alto saxophone sonata for Kenneth Che, the same person that premiered the Concerto after Glière, I misunderstood what he told me when I asked him what the lowest note on the saxophone was. He said one note, and I thought he was talking about the concert pitch or the transposed pitch, and he was actually talking about the concert pitch. And so I didn't write the lowest several notes on the instrument in that first sonata. But so those are all things that any composer has to learn if you're going to write successfully. And you also have to understand the characteristics of the instrument that I'm touching the screen because a message came on my wife's iPhone that I had to get rid of. But at any rate, let's see, what haven't I answered in that last question? I tend to ramble a lot and I can't remember what I've talked about and what even the question was sometimes. So
no, that's totally fine. Like kind of maybe some insight into your creative process as far as, coming up with an idea and developing that. I noticed that a lot of your after Glière, there's been a series of after composers. So maybe a little bit about the inspiration you take from these composers in writing.
Right. Well, yes, let me return to that, but let me give you a few ideas about my compositional process. When I get a commission from someone, I'd like to think about both the person I'm writing for, the instrument I'm writing for, and the kind of piece they've asked me to write for some time before I actually write any of it down. Because I find that, at least for me, the beginning of a piece is always the hardest. But if I start to think of it for a week or two before I actually put anything down into the computer, and I get a good idea for an opening, that's really all that I need, because listening back to what I've written then will tell me pretty much what needs to come next in the piece. And so once I get that opening solidified, and sometimes I have to start the opening several times. In my quintet after Schumann, the third movement gave me a lot of trouble. And I had to write the opening 6 or 8 times before it caused me to realize that the piece was going to go in the direction that it needed to go. And so I just had to throw away 6 or 8 openings for it before I got the one that I knew was going to develop the movement in the right way. So then what I do, I usually write in the evenings. Is when I do my best writing, and the ideas seem to come best. And before I go to bed, I print out whatever I've written that day, and I take it to bed with me and just proofread it in as I'm lying before I go to sleep. And then the next morning, any corrections that I see, just looking at the score, I will make first thing in the morning, but I generally won't write any more until later in the evening. So in my after series, yes, the Concerto after Glière is the first piece in a way of my after series, but one piece doesn't make a series, as you well know. And so it wasn't until that work became popular in the saxophone world, and a saxophonist friend of mine asked me to write a piece for him. And I said, well, sure. I said, what kind of a piece would you like? And he said, I really love the music of Johannes Brahms. So I would love it if you would write a piece for alto saxophone, violin, and piano, a trio after Brahms. And so that work was the second in the After series and really made it into a series, which now is up to 16 or 17 works. I've just received a commission last night for a work in the style of Dave Baker, who is a well-known jazz professor at IU until his death a couple of years ago. And he was promising this saxophonist a work for his instrument, and unfortunately he died, as far as I know, before writing a single note of it. So instead of getting one from Baker, this poor guy has to pay me money to get something in his style. But Dave Baker was a good friend of mine, and I'm happy to write a piece in his memory and in tribute to him. So my After series, as I say, comprises so far 16 or 17 works. And I would say that these pieces probably account for 80% of all the performances my music is getting now, because they fulfill a need that I didn't realize was there. I never realized that Concerto After Glière would become as popular as it has become. It's been performed at least 200 times to my knowledge, and I think about 35 countries. And so I never dreamed that I would have a piece like that, but by the mercy of God, I just stumbled into something that filled a need in the world of music. And I think any composer that can find a need and fill that need in classical music can produce something that's going to be widely played. So these pieces, these 16 or 17 pieces, form maybe 15% of the total number of pieces in my mature output, and yet they account for 75 or 80% of my performances. So supply and demand, like any other enterprise, if you fulfill a demand with a product, people are going to be interested in it.
Thank you. So you talk about like a sort of a need, a niche that was filled by these pieces. Can you talk to the students a little bit about that?
The niche was, in the case of the After pieces, was simply to write music in the style of other composers who never wrote for certain instruments. I have gotten pieces written in the styles of Glière, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, Poulenc, and Grieg, and a number of other composers, Scott Joplin. I wrote a ragtime sonata after Joplin. Many of these works are for saxophone because the saxophone was invented too late to have had music in the romantic style written for it. So one of my works is a concerto after Tchaikovsky for soprano, saxophone, and orchestra. And that piece has also been pretty widely played because Tchaikovsky never even probably knew the saxophone had been invented, so he couldn't have possibly written for it. And of course, Brahms probably didn't even know about the saxophone either. So that's the niche that my After pieces fill. But that's not the only niche that exists out there in the classical music world. My publisher told me last year, when I asked him, I said, what other kinds of demand is there in a publishing world for pieces that don't have enough repertoire yet? And he said, well, works for alto saxophone, violin, and piano are in demand now, and there's not that much repertoire. So I wrote a piece called To Be Determined, where the movement of the 6 pieces in the suite are selected at random to be played in any order. And he's already brought that out and has already been selling. So there's lots of niches, but you will have to know what the demand is before you can try to fill that demand. So you should ask musicians what kind of pieces they would like to have that don't really exist much, or maybe a publisher or somebody like that. And then you could find your own niche and write some music to fulfill that niche. That is, if you want your music to be played. Some people don't care if the music is played, but for me, philosophically, if a piece isn't performed, it might as well have never been written. I just don't write music that's going to sit around in drawers unperformed.
Right. So would you say that you compose mostly or exclusively on commission nowadays?
Mostly, although I do still write works that I think I want to write. that I feel a need to write, or I feel like there's a need for works in that idiom. But to write a string quartet, I would have to have a commission, because there's been so many thousands of great string quartets written by masters of the art of composition that it would be likely mine would just sit around and not be performed. So if somebody wants to pay me to write one, I'll be happy to do that. And incidentally, I think every young composer should write a string quartet, because it's great training. And so I'm not saying that you should not write a string quartet, but don't expect that the Juilliard quartet is going to immediately want to perform it or whatever.
Can you speak a little bit to some of the different challenges or thought processes that come into play when you're writing, like a concerto or anything like that? Because many of these works are, for solo instruments or concertos. How do you approach that differently than writing, something like a string quartet or a large ensemble piece that doesn't feature a soloist?
Well, if I'm writing a concerto, especially one in my after series, of which there are at least a half a dozen now, I think more than that actually, the main difference between writing that kind of a work, a large scale orchestra work, and writing a chamber piece, is that for a chamber piece, I write it into the score as the instruments would appear. In other words, if it's a string quartet, writing all four parts. Mm-hmm. But for a concerto, I write it in short score, because I've done it both ways. I wrote the concerto after Glare into a full score, but I've tried it both ways, and I really like the idea of it just seems to work really well for me to write it as a piano reduction first, and then orchestrate it later on. It also saves any publisher that publishes a concerto is also going to bring it out in a short score in a piano reduction anyway. So if you do that first, you've already got that problem solved. And it just seems to be a lot more conducive to working quickly. I can write an entire concerto doing it this way in about 4 to 6 weeks. Mm. The concerto after Glare actually was written in less time than that. The first movement was written in about a week, as I recall.
Now, some of your recent output, some of these concertos, the after series, they're for orchestra and soloists. Some you've transcribed or reorchestrated for wind ensemble. What have you found to be some of the differences, other than instrumentation, of course, when writing for one group or the other?
Right, you mentioned making different versions of the same piece. An extreme example of that is my concerto after Mendelssohn. I originally wrote it for trombone and piano, intending to make it into a trombone and orchestra work. And then the trombonist for whom I wrote it, who's on the faculty here at Indiana University, wanted to perform it with our symphonic wind ensemble here. And so I made a version for wind ensemble. But I wanted to make it such that it could have conceivably written by Mendelssohn for the particular instrumentation that I used to a certain degree. Now, I did put saxophones in the wind ensemble, and Mendelssohn probably didn't, the saxophone wasn't even invented when he died. So he wouldn't have known about a saxophone, but I tried to make it in a more of a chamber music ensemble. I didn't use any tuba, for instance, because I thought that would be too heavy for the light spirit of Mendelssohn. The lowest instrument I used in the orchestration for that wind ensemble version was a euphonium. And so I used 5 clarinets. I used 3 clarinets. The clarinets, the B-flat clarinet parts 1, 2, and 3 are the only parts in the piece that are doubled. And all of the other parts, the 2 flutes, 2 oboes, an E-flat clarinet, bassoon, and down the line, are all played by single players. And it kept that Mendelssohnian lightness, I thought, better than if I had put it for the full wind ensemble. And but the effect of the wind ensemble version is quite a bit different from the orchestral version of the thing, of that same work, simply because of the nature of string, sound, and all of that. But I thought it worked very well in the wind ensemble version.
Thank you. Professor, do you have any questions that you want to add?
I do. Yeah, David, one of the fun parts of this that we've gotten into here with the different composers is to hear about their life. And what I notice about your life is that you developed a business that basically has sort of financed your ability to kind of pursue your dream of being a composer. And, these days, there's a lot of angst out there about making a life in music anyhow, not to mention this whole pandemic that we're dealing with. So
Right.
a number of the students have been, I think, really appreciative of hearing about the struggles and kind of how you got around that and and your particular business, I think, is really, really fascinating. So if you go into that, that'd be great.
Okay, yes. As I briefly mentioned before, I, for 42 years, have been a dealer in used and out-of-print classical records. It's primarily LPs, but I do deal in CDs and even 78 RPM recordings. And for those students who don't know what a 78 RPM record is, probably what your great-grandparents were playing in their home. They may have even had one of these wind-up, they call them Victrolas. It was a record player that didn't even need electricity to operate. You put the record on, put the tone arm down, crank the thing up, and it would play for a whole 4 minutes before you had to rewind it. So when I finished my graduate work at Indiana University, I really honestly was not taken with the idea of going into academia because I had been an associate instructor there in theory and not in composition, but they had positions available when I was there in theory for AIs. And so I taught theory. I taught several required courses that all the students had to take. And I discovered that about 25% of the students were really interested in anything I was teaching. 50% of them were willing to tolerate the idea of my existence. And the other 25% we won't discuss at all. So I was not propelled into academia. It wasn't until years later that I was asked to teach in a pastor's college and had students that really wanted to learn what I was teaching that I discovered what a joy teaching actually is. But that's another story. I won't go off into that tangent. So I had to make a living somehow. And as I alluded, I took a brief job as a music library supervisor, which I thought was at least related to music that I had studied in. And I was even considering going back and getting an MLS degree after I finished my doctorate. But then I discovered that after I had come up with all the creative things I could do to improve the efficiency of the music library here at Indiana, then the tedium set in, and I decided that was not going to be my career after all. But concurrently with taking that job as a music library supervisor, I also, at almost exactly the same time, having been a record collector and coming across a lot of duplicate records and seeing records in the used record stores, and this is back when LPs, before CDs were around, LPs were the king in those days. This is 1978 we're talking about, just to give you some historical perspective. And at that time, I was seeing a lot of records in used record stores that I knew were out of print and sometimes rare, but I didn't want them for my own collection. Well, being an impecunious graduate student, I didn't have any means of buying up large quantities of records to see if there was really a market for records out there. But for my first list, I took the duplicates that I had accumulated for my own collection and added those to titles that I just jotted down from the various used record stores that I haunted in those days, and traded a list of names of record collectors from a dealer for his choice of a few records off that first list. And that launched me into the record business. And within about 2 years, I found myself as the largest dealer of vinyl in the world, for classical music at least. Now, that's not really saying, it's not like saying I'm the largest of car salesman or computer manufacturer, because we're talking about it being a big fish in a very, very small pond here. But in any case, it was enough to give my wife and myself a good living all these years, and to free me up from the financial concerns of trying to make a living writing music or being involved in any other kind of musical endeavor. you know, you've all heard the joke, you know, how do you get the musician off your porch? You pay him for the pizza. And so I think I've lost your sound, Tim.
Yeah, that's awesome, though. That's a great joke. I will remember that joke. That's a good one. Hey,
So
just a couple geeky questions. So what's like the most expensive rare record that you ever sold?
it was the Bach sonatas and our partitas performed by the Romanian violinist George Enescu,
Oh, wow.
who was a sort of a legendary violinist. He was also a wonderful composer.
Yes.
Most people only know his Romanian Rhapsody #1, but he wrote some tremendous music that completely dwarfed that work in their quality, in my opinion. And but he was a sort of a historically very important violinist as well. And the recording of the Bach sonatas and partitas are just happen to be one of the more collectible works. There are collectors out there who want every recording of that piece, along with the Bach cello suites. And so that Enesco set was issued back around the time I was born in 1950, and it was on a label that did not sell well. It caught Enesco at the past his peak as a violinist. It was only, in fact, a couple of years before he died that he made that set. And so it didn't sell well, and it's exceedingly rare today. I've only seen a couple of copies of it in my 42 years. But when I found it, I put it on my list for $7,500 and sold it.
Wow.
So,
Wow. That's amazing. So that one other question about that business. So vinyl's kind of come back a little bit from what my son is kind of into this. And so have you seen a little bit of a resurgence of interest in that at all?
well, everybody tells me, you know, they hear I'm a dealer and they say, oh, vinyl's making a comeback. You must be really happy. Well, what I tell people is if it was up at the ceiling when the LP was the dominant format of recorded sound, and it sank to the floor when the CD came in, a few years after the CD came in, it's come up maybe in the classical area, it's come up maybe 6 inches.
Oh.
So not a major resurgence. It is more of a resurgence in the pop field than it is in the classical.
Yes.
But diehard contingent of collectors out there that believe that analog sound is superior to digital sound, and they have a good basis for that, actually, that opinion, because your ears hear in analog, and anything that's recorded digitally has to be converted to analog sound before you can hear it. And so digital music is sampled about 50,000 times a second. If you could increase that sampling rate to infinity, you would basically have analog sound. So analog really is a gold standard because your ears hear in analog. And there are a few people with good enough ears, mine aren't, to hear the difference between really good analog reproduction and digital reproduction. But the gap has closed because when CDs first came out, they were pretty awful, I thought. And the gap between digital sound and analog sound technology has increased to where someone like myself can't tell the difference. And I think you'd have to have really good ears to hear the difference now, and maybe $100,000 hi-fi system to play your records on.
Right. I personally prefer analog, and I'm with you. When I'll never forget the first CD I heard. It was in Tokyo, and I was in a Japanese friend's car, and he played a CD in his car. I thought it was the worst thing I ever heard in my life. I just thought it was so bright and abrasive and crazy.
Yeah,
and you're right, they fixed a lot of that, of course, but yeah, for sure. Hey, Chris, it might be good, Dave Lynn, if you're there, it would be a great opportunity for you to meet David, come on screen and ask him a little bit about maybe chemistry, if you would like, and certainly the concerto. So I saw him on the call. I don't know if he's still here. David, are you in, Dave?
He's
I got
in. Yeah, he put yes in the chat.
Yeah, as you said, yes on my screen momentarily there. So I guess he's online.
Yeah, Dave, try hit your mic so you can talk to him directly. That'd be great, just so he can meet you.
Hi.
There he is.
It's early in the morning. I lose my voice somehow.
He's in Taipei, I should say again, David Canfield. He's in Taipei talking to you.
Do you speak Mandarin?
Yeah. Hmm.
I can say ni hao. That's about all I know in Mandarin.
Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, yeah. So for most of the answers on your website, one of the question is um, what's up? Like, how do you find out you really love music more than chemistry? Like, what's the thing that make you find out that?
What made me change from music, from chemistry to music? Are you
Hmm.
asking?
I
Yeah.
think he's asking, why do you love it, or why did you decide you love it more? I think that's a good question, because you're talking to somebody in Dave Lynn who loves music and is a chemistry major. So it's perfect.
Right, exactly. Well, um, I guess one of my early heroes in music was Alexander Borodin, the Russian composer who wrote the Polovetzian dances and Prince Igor and some other famous pieces. He was a chemist who dabbled in music. And so even when I was a chemistry major, I loved Borodin because I got inspiration from that fact that he was well known as a chemist in his day, and became famous as a musician, as a composer, only after he died. In fact, probably within, it took probably 20 or 30 years before he became better known as a composer than he had been known as a chemist and a teacher of chemistry. But other than that model of Borodin, there was a couple of things. I think I talked about a little bit about my transition already, that I felt that I wasn't going to be a top flight chemist, and I thought that I could be better than average in music perhaps. But there was an incident that happened right in that period where I was moving away from chemistry towards music. And most of you who are watching this won't be old enough to remember Life magazine, but Life magazine was popular in the 60s, late 60s, when I was in chemistry. And in those days, they had a humorous photo on the last page of every magazine that told a story in a humorous way, didn't even need a caption. It was just basically something humorous. Well, one issue that I happened to see showed this chemist in his laboratory. He had just received a doctorate in chemistry from Stanford University, which is a major school for chemistry. And he had sent out 700 applications to various jobs around the country. He had gotten all but 2 of them back, all rejections, and he had them all hanging from the ceiling of his laboratory, all 700 of these rejections. And I thought, if I'm going to be out of a job in something, why not be out of a job in something that I really particularly love? And so it wasn't that the ability to get a job in music in the late 1960s was any better than it was in chemistry. It was probably not the best time to be getting a job in any field, but that was sort of what pushed me over the edge, I'd say, into music. And I also knew that I could go up to the college where my father was head of the music department, live with them and get free tuition because of his faculty position there, and it wouldn't cost me or them any money for me to change. So those are a couple of factors that pushed me over into music. And then my grandmother helped along too by offering to finance my first year of graduate school. And after that, I had an associate instructorship, and they waived my tuition on that basis. So I didn't need much to live off of in those impecunious student days.
Right. I just love that. If I'm going to be out of a job, I might as well be out of a job in something I love. I love that. That's a keeper. Dave, anything else, Dave?
That's pretty much it. Thank you so much.
It's
For
good
you,
to see you.
could I ask you a question, Dave?
Yeah, sure.
How did you find out about Concerto After Glière?
Oh, one of my friends practiced that piece, and I love it really much. So I decided to play it.
Well, I hear accounts that you're very good, and you must be to have won 2 different competitions. What are you going to play on the orchestra concert?
It's a transpose from Sarasate's piece, it's Ziegenweisen. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's a violin piece.
Oh, by Saint-Saëns, did you say?
No, by Sarasate.
Oh, Sarasate. Oh, one
Mhm.
of his Hellenistic showpieces. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I music pretty well, although I don't know which piece you might be thinking of. But at any rate, that's terrific. Well, I really appreciate your interest in the Concerto after Gliar.
Mhm.
Thanks for getting up, Dave.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do this. I ask everybody to think about questions, and this is a great time. Chris, are you fielding them, or Corey? Who is fielding questions? Or you can certainly come on live if you like Dave did.
I have a question that's been submitted already, and then I guess if anyone can just in the chat, you can just send it to me or send to everyone. That's fine. So this question, David, this person says they love asking this question of record shop owners. What are some of your favorite records?
Oh, wow. I could be glib and say whatever I'm listening to at the time, but I won't do that. I think some of my favorite records are records or CDs in many cases that introduced me to the work of a composer that I had not encountered previously. And once I heard a little snippet of his or her music, realized this is wonderful music. What else has he written or she written? Because some of them have been women. And so a record that opens up a new world for me has always been a favorite. One of my early discoveries in that regard was the Sixth Symphony of the Danish composer Carl Nielsen. I came across a record early in my collecting. This is before I was a dealer, but early in my collecting, I came across the Philadelphia Orchestra under Ormandy's recording of the Nielsen Sixth Symphony. It's called Sinfonia Semplice. It's anything but simple. Semplice is Italian for simple, if you don't know. And so it's just a wonderful work. It was pretty much avant-garde in its day, which is back in the 1930s, I think. But it opened up my eyes to the brilliance of Carl Nielsen as a composer. Other recordings are just great, no matter when you discover them or how you discover them. And there was a cello faculty member at Indiana University named Janos Starker, who was widely considered to be one of the greatest cellists in the world, in fact, who ever lived. And he was on the faculty here at IU. But even before I became aware of his excellence as a cellist, because of his faculty position here, was when I discovered his Bach cello suites on the Mercury label. It's just one of the all-time great recordings ever made, not only in his performance of the Bach suites, but also the recorded sound, the presence that you felt like he was in the room playing there for you personally. And of course, the music by Bach is just some of the most glorious music. So those are two particular examples of records that I particularly like, but there's hundreds of others. So I won't try to think of all of them by any means, but there are so many out there.
I think one of the interesting things I read up on your website is, and I think it would be interesting to talk about, is two things. Sorry. Number one, your sort of interaction with the Library of Congress, because they bought out a lot of your collection, right, at one point. And number two, I think recently you've been into collecting orchestrations or versions of Pictures at an Exhibition by Mussorgsky. Is that
Oh,
right?
yeah. Yeah, well, I could talk longer than anybody wants to hear about either of those things, but in brief, being the largest dealer in the world for classical records, especially LPs, meant that an awful lot of records passed through my hand. And as a collector, I was not just a dealer, I was an avid and active collector. So all of those, literally, I estimate that in the years that I was putting out lists, I don't put out lists anymore, I just deal in records on a wholesale basis. But I estimate between the lists that I put out and the wholesaling I've done in the last 42 years, I have physically touched something like 20 million records. And I had the first choice of any of those records that came through my hands to keep it for my own collection if it was something that interested me. And basically, if it was a piece of music I didn't have, it interested me. So I developed extremely wide tastes in music, all the way from Palestrina to Penderecki, I would tell people, although it extended before and after even those two composers. And so I have literally heard, and I should back up and say that I've heard probably more music by more different composers than anybody else who's ever lived, for the simple reason that during the 27 years that I was typing monthly catalogs for my record customers, I couldn't do anything while I was typing probably 10 days out of every month, doing from early morning to late at night typing of the list. The only thing I could do was listen to music. So I constantly listened to music. And so I've heard music probably by 20,000 or more different composers, and more than 200,000 different pieces of music. So that's all the background to why the Library of Congress was interested in my collection. It was a unique collection. There was nothing else like it anywhere in existence. They sent a representative over to Bloomington from Washington to inspect the collection, and shortly after that, they emailed me and said, yes, we want to buy your collection. And the deal that I worked out with them was they would pay me a minimum amount of money, and then they could have any of the records that they wanted from my collection up to a certain number, above which, if they went above that number, they had to pay so much per record beyond that number. And I shipped to them then over a 4 or 5 year period, since it was more than their budget would allow to purchase all at one time, 60,000 records and CDs. And the deal that we had was that they would return anything that they already had to me, because there were things that I would get back that were common records perhaps, but I still liked them and wanted to have something to listen to. And so I actually whittled down my collection even after they returned about 40% of it to me as things they already had in their collection. So I whittled that down to about 5,000 records, and it's expanded again now to more like 10,000 since then, because I said, oh, I need to have this back in my collection again. So at any rate, that's the Library of Congress story. And so pictures at an exhibition. Why pictures at an exhibition? There are other collectors out there who collect every recording they can find of a given work. And I never set out in my early days of collecting to do that, to collect every recording of any particular piece of music. But as I began dealing in records, I started seeing very many different recordings of this work in very many different arrangements of it. Everybody knows the original piano version of it that Mussorgsky actually wrote, and everybody knows Ravel's orchestration of it. But there are a huge number of composers that have arranged that piece for every conceivable and some inconceivable combinations of instruments, like accordion orchestra, for instance. Or I have a version that incorporates the Arabian oud in it. Just every imaginable combination of instruments. Somebody out there has arranged that work for it. And so I started to see how many different arrangements and how many different performances I could get of the work. And right now I'm up to over 600 and almost 700 different arrangements of the piece. And I have 2,000 recordings of the various arrangements that I have uncovered so far, 2,000 different performances of it. So it's not that I listen to it all the time by any means, although I do think it's a wonderful piece of music. It's a great masterpiece. It was, for its day, one of the most avant-garde, if you will, works ever written, because Mussorgsky stretched the boundaries, the tonal boundaries of music beyond what any other composer up to his time had done. The only composer that came close to him was Liszt in his later works. And he was writing, Pictures was written in 1874, and I believe that Liszt's late works were written after that, where he really went even further than Mussorgsky did in stretching the boundaries of tonality. So just because of its uniqueness, it also was the work that has turned on a lot of people who are not interested in classical music to classical music. The Emerson, Lake and Palmer rock version turned a lot of people on to classical music, a lot of young people. It also was the first major work to use the idea of artwork being represented in music. And I found that concept very fascinating as well. I have since written a work based on a piece of art, not by Victor Hartmann, who Mussorgsky's inspiration was, but the Swiss painter Paul Klee. I've written a work for flute and chamber orchestra called Cat and Bird Concertant Music after Paul Klee. So that pictures and exhibition has inspired me as a composer of contemporary music to write music as well.
I just got to break in and ask, this is starting to hit me. So at the apex of your collection, how many records did you have?
60,000.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, and I realized a long time before I got anywhere close to 60,000 that it was more music and more hours of music represented in that collection than anybody, even if I lived to be 200 years old, which I don't think is terribly likely.
Right.
I would never hear all of those pieces more than once, if even that many times. And so the Library of Congress probably got, I would say, out of those 60,000 records, there were at least 20,000 records that I had not heard even the first time, because there's only so many hours in the day, and you're not going to hear everything. So at some point I began putting together the collection, realizing that it would be a good investment. And indeed, when we got the money and we bought some income property from it, so I don't have to work full time in the record business any longer, because we've got money coming in from our property that record collection basically paid for.
So you must have, you must have had some kind of big building for this, right? Did you have a big warehouse or something?
When I was in the retail record business, I had a 3,000 square foot business building on the same property that our house was on. It was originally an outbuilding for the previous owners, Kubotas and I don't know, landscape equipment, but I fixed it up and made it into my record. I had a 700 square foot office. I had another big room, 900 square feet, just for the main inventory. I had offices for my employees. In those days, I needed up to 7 employees to help me process the orders and wrap them and pull them off the shelf and all of that.
Wow. Wow. It's just brilliant. It's amazing. That's just amazing. Okay, sorry to divert there, Chris. More questions?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your answers, David. Next question is from another student who asks, do you think your diverse background in chemistry, library work, and music has influenced your compositions? Would you say your compositions are different from other composers of our time because you had the opportunity to branch out into different fields?
Okay. You might have to remind me of the second question because once I get talking, then it will go out of my feeble brain. But the first question, I believe, was, has my diverse background influenced my style of writing? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. It's hard to say what has influenced me, but I would guess that one reason, well, let me just say one of my premises about being a composer, and then I'll explain why I'm saying that. For most composers, originality is the holy grail that must be sought at all cost. Okay. Frankly, I think originality is overrated. And the reason I think that is because it often forces composers into writing a kind of music that is not natural to them as a person in an attempt to be original. Now, the fact is, we're all individual people. Nobody is exactly like another person, not only in genetic makeup, but no two people are alike in their experiences. And I think our experiences, especially the ones that involve music, hearing music, or performing music, all contribute something to those of us who have not only performance experience, but also experience in writing music. And so it's an extremely complex situation that only the mind of God could unravel. But so it's really a question that I can't answer very satisfactorily, except to say that I'm sure that everything that's happened to me in my life has influenced me in some respect, not always in regard specifically to my writing music, although if it did, it might have done so in a way that I would not be perceptive of. In other words, we can be influenced by things that we're not aware of the influence. And so I don't have any doubt that some of the things that have happened to me have influenced my music writing. Now, when I was the head of this music library, one of the things I had to do was to file cards into the card catalog. This is pre-computer days, mind you. And so if somebody wanted to come in the library and see if we had a particular piece of music, they had to flip through an alphabetized card catalog. And so one day a set of cards came in from the card cataloging department of Indiana University, and I had to file all these cards in there, and in one of the batch of cards was every conceivable phonetic pronunciation or spelling, I should say, of the name Chopin, and they even had a Chinese version, which is something like Chopin or something like that, and they had it spelled Shopan for people who wanted to. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to put those cards in the card catalog. If a person is ignorant enough not how to spell one of the greatest geniuses of the world of music has ever known, he doesn't deserve to find Chopin's music. I don't know, it was a quirk I had. I'm sure that little incident from my library days may have influenced me somehow, but I just related to show you the kinds of things that happen in any job that you might have, and it may have influenced me, but I couldn't possibly tell you how it's influenced my music if it ever did. So yes, I'm sure I've been influenced by many, many different things, but as to specifics as how they influenced me, I have no idea.
Thanks, David.
Now,
I think that's a great answer.
Now, the other question was what? Help my memory.
I think you sort of answered it already. The other part of the question is, would you say your compositions are different from other composers of our time because you had the opportunity to branch out into different fields?
If my music's different from anybody else's, and of course, even my afterpieces where I'm consciously trying to recreate the style of an older composer, they're going to be different from the music that composer would have actually written. There's no question about it. I can't help but some of me coming into my trio after Brahms or my concerto after Tchaikovsky or Glier or whatever. I can't help but have some of that influence from me come into that piece. And so, yes, we're all individuals, and our music is all going to be individual, especially if we're true to our own artistic convictions. Every composer has an idea of what makes a great piece of music. Every idea is going to bring his or her personality into the ideas that he or she has, and make as good a piece of music as he or she possibly can. And so, I guess yes, the answer, that's pretty much the answer I have to the second part of the question.
All right, thank you, David. I have another question from a student, I guess along similar lines. Is there one composer that has been your biggest inspiration, influence? Or in other words, who is your favorite composer of all time?
That's really difficult to say. The first part of the question, is there one composer that's been a bigger influence to me than any other, would have to be broken down into various periods of my life, because because I did not know, outside of the very famous composers, when I was very young, I did not know the music of somebody like Carl Nielsen, much less somebody like Frederick Reshevsky. But in my early years, I was influenced by the music I was hearing at the time. And so some of the composers that I would have been hearing in my early years would have been Beethoven, Brahms, Mendelssohn, Chopin, the big names, of classical music. And so I'm sure that my music, in fact, some of my first after pieces, even though I didn't call them after pieces, I wrote 4 preludes when I was probably about 15 or 16. And I deliberately was trying to imitate the style of Chopin in the first 3 of them, and the style of Baudardin in the last of the 4 preludes, because I was quite taken with their music, and I thought it would be fun to see if I could imitate their style. I wasn't very successful in the Chopins. I don't think my Chopin attempts sound very much like him, superficially a little bit maybe. I think that Borodin was a little bit more successful. So yes, Borodin would be another composer who influenced me in my early days, and I got interested in his music, as I said, because of his being a chemist who wrote music. And so he was very influential. But then if you go throughout other periods in my life, then you have other influences. Certainly my own teacher, who was John Eaton, who was a famous teacher of microtonal music, influenced me. I wrote some microtonal pieces because of his influence, which I might not have ever done otherwise. In the last decade or so, I would say probably the most influential composer has been William Bolcom, who's on the faculty of University of Michigan, I believe. And the way he's influenced me is by using a technique called polystylism, where in the same piece, he will use different stylistic features in various parts of the piece. And so many of my recent works have this polystylistic flavor to them, where they shift from a greater tonal area to a lesser tonal one, maybe some hints of jazz here and there, this, that, and the other, some minimalism a little bit. I don't like minimalism as for an entire piece. Never have liked that. That's one kind of music I'm not very fond of. But as a tool in the composer's palette, it's a good thing to have the ability to do. Every composer needs to have a palette of different tools that he can use in a given piece. Some of them he may not use at all in a given piece, and other pieces might use a combination of the tools that he has at his disposal. But it's good to have that palette, and the way that you develop the palette is to listen to a lot of music and say, oh, I really like this in Alexander Chudovny's style, or in Miklos Rozsa, or some composer that you've heard. You really like this particular aspect of it, and that will give you a lot more tools from which to choose to create your piece.
So I just have to jump in and say that thank you for mentioning William Bolcom, because he's a graduate of the University of Washington.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he's one of my favorite contemporary composers because of his ability to write convincing music in such disparate styles.
Right. Have you heard his Symphony for Band?
I have. I believe I have it on a recording of it in my library.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
It's a wonderful piece.
Yeah.
Operas are very wonderful. He's just a great all-around composer.
Yeah. Chris, go ahead. Sorry.
No problem. Here's another question. If you were a young composer in your 20s or 30s today, what other music-related jobs outside of teaching would you pursue in the current music industry to support your composing career if needed?
Well, a lot of composers have had careers outside of music, sometimes very much outside of music. Charles Ives, you may know, was owned an insurance company, was very successful. It allowed him to write music that nobody wanted to listen to at the time, and he didn't give a whit if anybody listened to his music or published it or performed it, although he was happy when people did. John Alden Carpenter was also he's an American composer, not too well known today, but a talented composer, and he was outside of music. But as far as jobs that are related to music, I would say that the best way to have a job that's related to music, or at least in music, even if you're not making a living by writing music, which only a very few people can do, and not have to teach or do other things to augment the money they make from writing music. And I can say that I've never made more than $10,000 a year from my music. So I'd be a lot thinner than I am if I had to live off of that. So there are plenty of, if you're not only a composer, but a performer, then you have the opportunity to play an instrument in an orchestra or some ensemble, or if it's a piano, to teach it or to play it in chamber music ensembles or whatever. There's obviously the possibility of teaching too, for those who are not going to make enough money just writing music. I guess there's delivering the pizzas too. I mean, there's any number of things you can do outside of music, or at least outside of composing, to help support yourself. but I'm firmly convinced of the truth of the fellow who said, if you enjoy what you're doing, you'll never work a day in your life. And the record business has been very enjoyable for me. And so I'm like a pig in mud when I'm sorting through a record collection, because you never know what that next record will be. It'll be something rare or something you've never seen before. And even after 42 years, I constantly come across records that I've never seen before, because there's so many gazillions of them out there that have been produced.
That's awesome. I'm so glad you said I'm like a pig in mud. I say that all the time. I guess that comes from the Midwest. It's perfect.
That's a good Midwesternism. I'm a Floridian by birth, but I've lived here well over 2/3 of my life, so I guess I'm a Midwestern.
Yeah, I grew up a couple hundred miles from where you live in Illinois. So,
okay.
Yeah.
What part of Illinois?
About an hour south of Chicago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
On a farm. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
go, Chris. We have one last question left, and if anyone else has any more, please submit. But this is going to be an interesting question, considering you said you've listened to hundreds or thousands of pieces of music. What is your favorite composition, either by you or someone else, and why?
Well, I think I have to say Pictures at an Exhibition. If I have to pick one, it's not necessarily that I think it's better than anything that Brahms or Beethoven or Bach or one of the great masters of music has written, but it is a work of genius. And because of its forward-looking nature, its popularity in the music, you know, even people that are not musicians really like that piece a lot. And so the fact that I've collected 2,000 recordings of it, even if I were to pick it, say another piece of music, you'd say, no, you're a liar, because you've got 2,000 recordings of that work and you only got one of the Brahms symphonies or one of the Tchaikovsky violin concerto or whatever, you know? So I think that has to be the answer.
Well, David, this has just been really great. We can't thank you enough for your time. And I'm sure the students would really agree. Such an interesting life, and how you've cobbled together a career, and for the brilliant music you've written. And I again want to say to the students to get on his website and poke around. And I wanted to ask you too, David, what's just one last quick question. On your website, you have a number of wind ensemble pieces, but there aren't recordings. Do you have recordings of some of those works?
Yes, I do. And the students should know that my website is just, it's a brand new one. And I have an awful lot of my music that has recordings of it that I haven't had a chance to get up onto the site yet. If you give me another month or two, there should be an awful lot more music available on it. Yes, I have wonderful recordings of, for instance, the symphonic synthesis, which is a wind ensemble work performed by the U.S. Navy Band.
Wow!
But I haven't it up onto the site yet, so there will be more coming.
Oh, that's fantastic, because we're getting ready to program next year, and I would love to have access. That'd be great. Well, everybody, as is our custom, two things. We're going to applaud for David, and then we're going to let him go.